Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in linguistics. I am Pramod Pandey, Professor, Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Today we will look at prosodic phonology. We'll begin with the introduction to prosodic phonology, its motivation, principles and methods of analysis, and then illustrate them by focusing on two of the prosodic categories, namely the syllable and the foot. You are already familiar with these categories. Let's see what more needs to be known about them. At the outset, it must be said that there are two approaches to the study of stress and intonation in natural languages. One of them is known as prosodic phonology, about which we are going to begin to talk today and continue in the next module. The other is intonational phonology. Prosodic phonology, mainly proposed by Elizabeth Selkirk 1986 and Nesper and Vogel 1986, has its own units such as the syllable, the phonological word, phrase, intonational phrase, and these are used in prosodic phonology alone. In intonational phonology, we used another set of terms such as boundary tones, accentual tones, nucleus, and so on. The two approaches to the study of stress and intonation are in fact complementary. Intonation depends on the prosodic phonological characterization of sentences, analysis of sentences. We have on the screen a prosodic phonological representation of a sentence. The new book is a useful resource. Take a look at it. What you see here is at the bottom, you have the syllables. So we have 7 syllables. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 syllables. And then above them we have 4 feet, and then we have prosodic words, and then a slightly higher category. It is the category where we have clitics. This is also a prosodic word which incorporates into it the other remaining adjacent morphemes. And these 4 prosodic words constitute a prosodic phrase, and then one of them is chosen to be the part of intonational phrase. So the entire sentence, the new book is a useful resource, is organized in terms of the phonological categories as shown on the screen. On the screen now is a representation of the intonational structure of language. This is an Assamese sentence. As you can see, the terms here are like L star, HP, L star, L. We have boundary marker. So these are the terms which are used for tone, accentual tone, a low accentual tone, and a high prosodic phonological entity, and so on. Now let's begin with a brief history of prosodic phonology, how it came into being and how it was seen to be a very important theory to explain certain phenomena, processes such as stress, both at the word level and at higher levels, and how these categories that were proposed in prosodic phonology actually came to provide an explanation for many aspects of segmental phonology which are stated in terms of certain restrictions on their occurrence in the sentences. So initially, a word stress rule looked like what you see on the screen by Chomsky and Haller. This is a stress rule in English. It says a vowel is stressed, and then you have all those various conditions in finally, and then or in the penultimate position or the antepenal position, as we have seen it in an earlier module. But this kind of rule where you have in the context, a large sequence makes you wonder if there is any restriction on the conditions, environment of phonological rule. From the way the rule is stated, it appears there isn't. But then when we try to find out how many rules of this type exist that require a long sequence of context, we find that not really, or it's only the phenomenon of stress that seems to take into account such a long stretch as a context, as the environment of a rule. So it appears to be highly unnatural, and it seems that there is something else which is involved in accounting for word stress. And that's how the theory of metrical phonology came into existence. 1975 PhD thesis by Lieberman called the Intonational System of English, and then the theory of metrical phonology for word stress, and then by Lieberman and Prince and other related and important works such as Selkirk and Bruce Hayes and others. Now, we have seen in the last module how we have two ways of representing the prosodic categories of syllable and the word. We have had two versions, the tree structure version and the grid structure version. What is important to be noted here is that between the syllable and the word, a new category came to be introduced, and that this is one of the features of prosodic phonology. So we have a three-level category, namely the syllable, the foot, and the word, already proposed by metrical phonology. And these are seen here, for example, in a representation of the English word satisfactory. As you see, there are two stresses in it, so there are 2 feet, and the first syllable, first foot, is the one which has the primary stress to repeat satisfactory. Now, prosodic phonology came to incorporate not only these categories, but also larger categories. And that's what makes prosodic phonology the theory which contains in it various other prosodic categories and subsumes under it metrical phonology. Now, prosodic phonology was proposed around 1986 by Elizabeth Selkirk and by Nesper and Vogel in the same year, almost. There are two types of relationship which are seen between the structures of phonology and syntax. As you know, syntax also deals with phrases and sentences and words, and prosodic phonology also proposes words and phrases and sentences. Now, what is the relation between these two components? There are two different approaches to it. One is called the direct mapping hypothesis, and the other is called the indirect mapping hypothesis. The direct mapping hypothesis, or the direct reference hypothesis, simply says something like this. We quote from Carolyn Ferry's recent book, 2017, and I'll read. It assumes a direct relation between acoustic events on the one hand and morphosyntax and semantics on the other hand, without being mediated by phonology and prosodic domains. In the direct approach to intonation, pitch accents and boundary tones are directly mapped to syntactic or semantic constituents. In this conception of intonation, sets of acoustic features correlate with specific functional roles. So there's not much difference between the syntactic structure and the prosodic structure. The indirect mapping hypothesis is the one which is mainly advocated by prosodic phonology, the theory of prosodic phonology, and a large number of practitioners in prosodic phonology adhere to it. This, again, in the words of Carolyn Ferry, is one which conceives of the relationship between acoustics and meaning as being mediated by phonology, and in the case of intonation, by prosodic constituency and tonal grammar. From this perspective, intonational components are related to linguistic expressions organized in prosodic constituents. So this is the indirect mapping hypothesis. Now we take a look at the diagrammatic representation of prosodic units. As you see on the screen, we have the lowest level syllable, then metrical foot, phonological word, phonological phrase, intonational phrase, and utterance. There may be some other entities which are proposed by some phonologists, such as the clitic group, which is up between the phrase and the word, and then the mora, which is below the syllable. But by and large, these the ones you see on the screen are the ones which are largely represented. Now, an important thing about the prosodic categories is that they are hierarchically organized, and that the higher level units contain the lower level units. So each lower level goes to make up the higher level, which goes to make up the next higher level, until we come to the intonational phrase and further above utterance. We have then the metrical grid representation within the prosodic phonology that is being practiced today, of a sentence that was presented in the earlier, namely, the new book is a useful resource. As you see here, again we have 9 syllables marked on the grid, 4 feet, 4 phonological words, then phonological phrases and intonational phrases. This is the way prosodic phonology represents this. Now, are there certain principles of prosodic phonology which are unique to the theory of prosodic phonology, and thus which justify and motivate prosodic phonology? Yes, there are a few principles. The best known of them is known as the strict layer hypothesis, SLH. It's been proposed in different forms, but one of them is, as you see on the screen, by Nesper and Vogel. It consists of two sub-principles, principle 1 and principle 2. Basically what it says is, you read them on the screen and in your text, basically what the principle says is that that the lower level units all go to make up the higher level units, and the higher level units consist of all the lower level units. So there is the direct relationship between these categories of phonological phrase. It's not the case that a lower level unit is related to another, to not the immediately higher but something else. Now, in order to restrain the representation and interpretation of the phonological structure of languages within prosodic phonology, we have a couple of other principles also proposed. These are exhaustiveness principle and non-recursivity principle. What exhaustiveness says is that a higher level unit does not immediately dominate a unit lower than its immediate constituent. For example, a word cannot immediately dominate a syllable, because in between you have the foot. That's exhaustiveness. And then non-recursivity says that a prosodic unit of a certain level cannot dominate a prosodic unit of the same level. For example, a foot cannot dominate another foot. As we know in syntax, the notion of recursivity is the same used here as well to disallow recursive structures in phonology, in prosodic phonology. Now, all these, both these, exhaustiveness and non-recursivity, are principles which have been found to have violations. So, strict layer hypothesis is one which is generally maintained. The violations of the principles of exhaustiveness and non-recursivity have been examined, especially within the optimality theoretic analysis of the prosodic phenomena. How do we propose in the theory a certain phonological category as being necessary in the phonological structure. Nesper and Vogel propose 4 criteria for choosing a certain phonological category or for arguing for the motivation of a phonological category in the theory of phonological phrase. These criteria have to deal with 1, rule statement, then rule application, then phonetic tactic constraints, and prominence relations. What they mean is, one by one, that a prosodic category must be included in the statement of a rule. So if you're talking about a foot, then a foot must be there, visible within the rule. So foot is an environment. The other is that when it comes to domain of rule application, what it means is that the category is not included in the statement of the rule, but we know that the rule applies within this category. So there may be a segmental phenomenon which applies within words and which also applies within a phonological phrase, but not across phonological phrases. So we have to limit the application of the rule to the phonological phrase. That's the application of a phonological category, the use of phonological category within as a rule domain. And then some of these categories may also show that there are certain phonotactic categories, constraints, restrictions, which can be explained only in reference to these prosodic categories. So there may be syllabic structure phonotactic constraints, word structure phonotactic constraints, and so on. So phonotactic constraints are the third criterion for proposing a certain phonological category. And the last one is prominence relations. It so happens that the prosodic phonological categories are all bound by this general feature of prominence relation. So we know within the syllable, the rhyme is more prominent than the onset. Within a foot, we have one of the syllables being more dominant or prominent than the other syllable. Within a word, if there are multiple feet, then one of them is more prominent than the other. So it is this prominence relationships which also motivate certain phonological category. Now let's begin with the syllable. In this module, we will look at the syllable and the phonological word as prosodic categories. We have looked at their structure earlier, but now as part of the phonological theory, we will take a fresh look at them. The syllable. Now we will look at the motivation for the syllable as a category on all these, according to all these 4 criteria, namely rule statement, rule domain, phonotactics, and prominence relationships. But we will be brief with regard to stating the facts about these criteria, because we have already looked at the facts in earlier modules considerably in detail. Thus, rule statement. For example, we have looked at the process of Wheelerization in English in course 1 as well as earlier on in this module. What the rule says is that L is Wheelerized, that is, L is produced as O before a consonant or at the end of words. Now, such a rule is found to be better stated if we include the syllable within it. So, if the rule is simply stated as L is Wheelerized as the coda of a syllable. So, instead of saying at the end of the words or before a consonant, we simply say in the coda position of a syllable. So, the syllable is included within the statement of the L Wheelerization rule. Rule domain. When we talk about the phenomena of stress and of tone, we know that they they apply within the domain of, let's say, within the domain of the syllable. So it is a syllable which is stressed. It is a syllable which has a certain tone. So the syllable is the domain within which stress and tone apply. Phonotactic constraints. It's not uncommon to find that phonotactic constraints are statable in terms of the structure of a syllable. So what occurs as the onset of a syllable is different from what occurs in the coda position of a syllable. So often onsets have more segments than the codas. And then we have prominence relations, about which we have spoken in the previous modules. Now the prosodic foot, that's the next higher level. What is a prosodic foot? A prosodic foot is a category which contains one stressed and one or more unstressed syllables. Why do we need prosodic category? Can we justify it in terms of the 4 criteria we have used? Yes. Let's take a look at its use in the rule statement. Take a look at the data on the screen, data on reduplication in Diari, an Australian language. Let me read them. Say Dhaka, Dhaka Dhaka, Yata, Yata Yata, Kanini, Kani Kanini, Wakari, Waka Wakari. Now in the examples in B, what you find is compared to A, the A gives the impression that the entire stem is repeated, but B tells us that it's not the entire stem, but only a part of it. Something is left out. And then we are told what is left out is the what is included actually is and repeated is the foot, that is and whatever is outside the foot is not included in the reduplicated forms. So then when we say this, that is the rule statement, reduplication, we have to say that this is it is the foot, the segments within a certain foot, the syllables within a foot that are reduplicated. And thus we get Kani, Kanini from Kanini, because Kani is the syllable. How do we know it's the syllable? Because the final ni is also stressed. So only one of the feet, the first foot, is reduplicated, not the second foot. Rule domain. We have, just as we have seen that the foot must be included in the statement of the reduplication rule in the array, we also have rules which must be seen to be applying within the domain of a foot. For example, vowel reduction in English and in many languages. In fact, we have examples from English. Look at the data on vowel reduction in English. Let's read them. History, historic, photographic, photographer, commandant, commander. Now these words are related: history, historic, photographic, photographer, commandant, and commander. And what we notice is that there is an alternation between a full vowel and a schwa in all these. Now the explanation for this alternation given is that the schwa always occurs in a syllable that is unstressed. We also consider unstressed syllables to be the tail of the foot and the stressed syllable to be the head of the foot. So the rule is that when a vowel occurs in the tail of the foot, that is as the weak syllable, then it is reduced to schwa. Thus so the rule is said to apply within the foot. Now about the prominence relation, quite obviously feet depend on the relative prominence of syllables. We do not need any more example of this fact than has already been exhaustively discussed in earlier modules. That is, in fact, the notion of stress as relative prominence is at the basis of the development of prosodic phonology. As we have seen, we began with foot and stress in prosodic phonology and have gone on to, and will go on to, talk about the other prosodic categories in the next modules. Thank you.